And we're live.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the afternoon session. Um, and today at the studio, apart from me, the chair, and my project collaborator, Dr. Deepakushum Rai of IIT Ropar, we have Ashish Rajadhyaksha with us today, who doesn't need an introduction, of course. But for the sake of it, as a chair, I'm supposed to introduce Ashish. So Ashish is well known for his innumerable publications, ranging from the very first works on Ritik Ghatak, his involvement in the Journal of Arts and Ideas, his editing of the Encyclopedia of Indian Cinema, and some of his most recent publications include his monograph Indian Cinema in the Time of Celluloid From Bollywood to the Emergency, published from Indiana in 2009, and then his editing of Kumar Shahani's essays titled Shock of Desire and other essays published by Tulika in 2015. At the moment, Ashish is also involved in the creation of the largest database on Indian cinema, namely IndianCine.ma, and today, Ashish's presentation, as far as I know, and as his Paolo Cecchiusai inspired title indicates, it would be mostly on the film archive, its materiality, ephemerality, and his work with Indian Cinema and other relevant issues. So, off to Ashish.
Okay, thank you very much, Parichay. Thank you all. Can you all hear me? Is everything good?
Yes, Ashish, you're perfectly audible.
Okay, wonderful. First of all, thanks very much to both of you for having invited me, and also I remember very fondly our last meeting in Ropar, which was when before all this happened. Really, half a lifetime ago. Parichay and Deepakusham have specifically asked me to speak about IndianCine.ma, but I am going to slightly frame this within an archival context in terms of the kind of complex questions that involve the celluloid archives. And particularly also involve the kind of, you might say, the complexity of celluloid as material itself. Everybody who's here probably is aware of the fact that celluloid has now been declared by the International Federation of Film Archives as a material, just like sculpture or any material in an art museum, as something that has its own materiality, which is to be treated as such. So that means basically whether it's a positive or a negative or a sound negative or a picture negative or an internegative, it has to be treated in and of itself as material. This has been something that's been extremely confusing for film archives, which have not always seen it as such. And certainly it's been very confusing for a number of disciplines, such as communication studies, for example, which have always seen it as a medium of communication, never actually as material. So I think that the kind of crisis, if you like, of celluloid, which is a practical crisis for the film archives, as much as it is an intellectual crisis for film studies, especially when we move to digital platforms, is something that needs to be thought through, needs to be discussed before we talking about digital archives. And I'm going to frame it a bit like that. This title of my presentation, which is the absolute masterpiece R, which is the registered restoration TM trademark number 456 copyright, is you might say it's a term from Paolo Cecchiusai, who is the you might say the godfather of cellular archiving, the former archivist in chief of Rochester, and then the George Eastman Labs, and so on. This is kind of a book that he wrote in 2001, where he's written with great kind of concern and maybe some little cynicism about what archiving has come to mean. I want to begin this with a quotation from him, and I will sort of take that forward. So the first half of this is about some of the kind of questions concerning celluloid. He says, to dramatize the point, the crisis of the film archive, the crisis of celluloid, let us imagine, I'm quoting him here, to dramatize the point, let us imagine that a consortium of archives of the moving image has undertaken a new reconstruction of what we shall call the absolute masterpiece, registered, restoration number such and such. Directed sometime during the 1920s, that is the 1920s, by an undisputed genius of cinema. There is a whole series of names that we associate with being so-called undisputed geniuses of cinema. Let us assume then that the film has been available for decades. And incidentally, wasn't there another highly touted restoration of the same film just a few years ago? Yes, but some newly discovered footage may bring us closer to the look that the film had in the 1920s. In that case, good. Besides, because of recent improvements in laboratory techniques, we can now be sure that the images will be sharper than ever. In that case, very good. It almost seems that an incomplete nitrate negative of a foreign language version has come to light. Oh, in that case, excellent. And besides, some tinted prints were unearthed a few years ago, and it may now be possible to inject some color into the preservation copies. In that case, splendid. There's even an annotated script, censorship documents, and a complete set of previously unpublished production skill. In that case, what are we waiting for? Let us all, by all means, restore the absolute masterpiece once again for the umpteenth time. I mean, we've all seen this happen. We've all seen restoration after restoration after restoration of Battleship Potemkin, of Pather Panchali, of I don't know, the early Griffith or Citizen Kane, and it just keeps going on and on and on. A ghost, says Paulo Cecchi Usai, a ghost haunts the corridors of the film archives, the ghost of redundant restoration, otherwise known as new restoration. Its presence is hardly unexpected, yet it has now reached alarming proportions, affecting as it does institutions whose raison d'etre is the preservation of the moving image. I won't shed tears over the death of cinema, says celluloid archiving's greatest name. This might be its first real chance to be taken seriously. In fact, he says that the death of cinema may actually be the first time the archivists will take cinema seriously. I suppose by deciding what the film archive can do by knowing now what it cannot do. The tyranny of selection, of choice, of cultural discrimination. Consider it this way, he says. There's a physician, there are 10,000 patients, and there's enough medicine to cure perhaps 100. The physician is you. Consult your feelings. Which patients will you choose to treat? And what will you say to the 9,900, that is all the other films that are not absolute masterpieces, that are consigned to the scrapyard of history? Who are denied treatment while they watch the lucky minority, the Battleship Potemkins and the Pather Panchalis and the Citizen Kanes, exit the hospital. Restoring 1, 10, or 100 films is a symbolic gesture of little consequence, no matter how important the films, unless it is matched by an awareness of the untreated supplicants. This then is a little bit about untreated supplicants in the way that he talks about it. This is about how we can understand what these are. I'm going into my full screen now. The problem is that I lose all of you, so let's hope for the best here. This is one of the pages of indiancine.ma, which Parichay talked about earlier. This is the Siddheshwari restored page for it, which we'll come to in a minute. I want to sort of say a little bit about the death of celluloid. I think that this is a particular historical circumstance that we have not really theorized as a historical circumstance. And I think that the history of modern India, and in particular of histories of some of the episodes, such as the emergency that have to do with modern India, are related to the decline of the technologies that were the privileged technologies for talking about, if you like, the authorized technologies of describing, modernity or modern publicness or history itself. In one of his many aphorisms, Jean-Luc Godard is supposed to have said, actually I found that I couldn't track this, so I don't know where he said it. He's supposed to have said the history of cinema is the history of the Soviet Union. There is good reason, I believe, to see the career of celluloid as more or less coinciding with that of the modern nation state. If you look at the birth of the modern nation state in the very end of the 19th century and the end of the modern nation state, if that is actually seen as the end of, with the end of the Soviet Union, of course, the nation state has received an entire new lease of life thereafter. But if you look at the Soviet Union as a particular moment in at least the career of the decline of, shall we say, the welfare state, give or take, then I think that what we have to look at is also the demise of celluloid. as the end of something, as the end of something much larger in history. And that celluloid's transition into digital, when celluloid moves into digital, directly maps onto, I now want to suggest, the transition of the welfare state into the neoliberal state. So to that extent, actually looking at a much more substantive historical inscription of celluloid. I'm aware, of course, that we are speaking here of the emergency. And I want here to give two examples of two very different films as I speak of the decline of celluloid. The first example is one that I'm not going to spend much time over. This is Mrinal Sen's, Calcutta 71, which I have spoken about elsewhere. In fact, I spoke about it the last time in Roper. But what you have in front of you is one of a whole series of documentary sequences that Mrinal Sen used, suffused his Calcutta films in the late 60s and early 70s, films like Interview, Padatek, Chorus, Bhuvan Shom, and of course Calcutta 71 with. And then there were these students who got very interested in these films, not because of why Mrinal Sen was making them or because they had any interest in his theory of cinema, but they simply wanted to see the names and faces of people who had otherwise disappeared or been declared as missing or dead. What, of course, would happen is that not much later, Mrinal Sen himself would face that crisis that some of the students have faced, because some of the films that Mrinal Sen had made were themselves now going to be lost, as was going to be lost the original footage of Nehru's Tryst with Destiny speech. I want to actually speak about an instance with a little more time. That was a very famous instance of a film being destroyed during the emergency. The film itself is entirely insignificant. It's a film called Kissa Kursi Ka, which I'm sure everybody knows as the film that sent Sanjay Gandhi to prison for a month because he destroyed it. Now, Kissa Kursi Ka was a strange kind of satire. I remember when, after the film was destroyed and then the emergency was over, when Amrit Nahata, the chap who had originally directed the film, made it again. I was one of maybe 5 people who saw it in the Metro Cinema in Bombay. And I remember thinking that here was a kind of a strange and overdetermined satire where you had, if I'm not wrong, a woman played by Shabana Azmi whose name was Janata, and then the politician at the end of the film rapes Janata. So it was that kind of a film, but the film is one that faced this enormous censorship crisis, and it led to a situation where the entire state apparatus was dedicated towards the destruction of the film. And I want to say a little bit about that destruction of the film, but I think that symbolically and symptomatically, the way that the state went to war against celluloid at that point of time remains, I think, a very crucial part of Kissa Kursi Ka. I mean, Kissa Kursi Ka bears no relationship with the film that we've just discussed, Calcutta 71, or the film that I am going to discuss, Garitvi Ghatak, Sita Shekti Nodir Naam, except the fact that all of these films are made at the same historical moment and all of them were made on celluloid material. I want to spend a moment to talk about the extent of the war that the state declared on celluloid as material at that point of time. This is what, according to an India Today special issue on Kissa Kursi Ka, the prosecution, after the emergency was over and the Shah Commission had been appointed, this is what the prosecution was hoping to prove against Sanjay Gandhi. And it's a quite detailed thing. It says, 1. Amrit Nahata deposited one positive print of Kissa Kursi Ka in the Films Division Auditorium at Mahadev Road on 17th of May 1975, according to the order passed by the Information Ministry. 2. The entire film material was packed in 13 steel trunks and brought to New Delhi railway station on November 10th, 1975 by 2 INB ministry underlings named Kane and Sethi, following instructions from senior officials of the Information Ministry. 3. That these instructions emanated from Vidyacharan Shukla himself. 4. That the positive print in the Mahadev Road auditorium was collected by Deputy Secretary Ghosh on November 6, 1975 in his personal car, from where it was allegedly transferred to VC Shukla's staff car and driven to 1 Safdarjung Road, that is the residence of the Prime Minister himself. 5. The entire film material, which arrived in New Delhi from Bombay on November 10th, was received at the station by Ghosh and Shukla's special assistant V.S. Tripathi and allegedly loaded onto 2 tempo vans belonging to the Maruti company. Then they were driven by 2 Maruti drivers, Charan Singh and Ramchandar, to the Maruti factory in Gurgaon. The film material is unloaded and stored on the premises of Maruti, and then, under Sanjay Gandhi's orders, Senior Officer Khedekar burnt all the film material along with Assistant Secretary Officer Yadav and Watchman Om Prakash on two successive nights. It took them that much time to burn 13 reels or 13 trunks of celluloid material. Then what happens is that after the March general election, Sanjay orders the 13 trunks also collected and has the trunks themselves destroyed. In spite of the destruction, one trunk lid, one lock, one RCIA showing 13 galvanized iron trunks and a stock register showing 13 trunks, one intact film can, and 3 centimeters of burnt film were recovered from the Maruti factory premises. Then there is a whole series of further things about the Supreme Court saying, where is the film? Where is the film? And the IND ministry saying, we don't know where it is. Until at the end, they say that strike one more print from the negative, and they say, well, we don't even know where the negative is. And then, Amrit Nahata basically withdraws, apparently under pressure from Vidyacharan Sukla, withdraws his complaint. And so then the matter goes into history. There is something to be said about the destruction of celluloid, which I think is symbolically and symptomatically of immense significance. I want to move to another film, very, very different film in history, but I want to say a little bit about celluloid here. This is one of Ritwik Ghatak's films, last films, Titash Ekti Nodir Naam, a film that is a very famous one that everybody knows, I'm sure, quite well now. And I want to say a little bit about my own memory, history about knowing, let's say not one, but 4 films called Titash Ekti Nodir Naam. In 1981, Parichay mentioned it, and I hope my old friend Amrit Gangar is here today amongst those present, because I wrote this book called Return to the Epic on Ritwik Ghatak in 1981. It was published by Amrit Gangar and by Screen Unit. That book, a little monograph, was sort of relatively well received at that point of time. But the important thing about that particular book was, and I wrote in that book about Megha Katara and Komal Gandhar and all those films, was that I had not had a chance, as none of us had a chance to see Titash Ekti Nodir Naam. Titash had been made just a few years earlier. It would have been made a decade earlier in the early 1970s, but in early 1981, it was nowhere to be seen. And while some people had seen it and others had known yet other people who had seen it or had seen rushes of it or had heard about it and had the belief that this was one of the true masterpieces that Ghatak had made, the fact was that we had more or less begun to assume that this was going to be one of those unknown masterpieces, not unknown at that time as a phenomenon, like Eisenstein's Bezin Meadow, a film that had been made but not shown or never to be shown. The idea of a film that had been lost to history was something that we had known as a phenomenon and were used to. And I think we sort of consigned Titash, if you like, to history as one of those masterpieces that we had not seen and probably would never see. Let me call that Titash, the film that is unknown, unseen, undiscussed, except by people who had heard about it, as Titash 1. This happened in 1981. In 1984, I happened to be in the Nantes Film Festival, the Festival of Three Continents at Nantes, and they actually had Titash with them. And they said that this was the first time in Europe that Titash was being shown. That Titash was presented as an unfinished film. It was the official presentation structure of the film that it was unfinished. It was something like 3 hours and 20 minutes long, and it was shown without subtitles. Now, I don't follow Bangla, and I saw it as a completely chaotic, crazy, unfinished film, the kind of work of a master that was not able, who had all kinds of things in his head. It was like a film that constituted a kind of a crazy set of sketches. It was extraordinary as an experience, but it had a chaotic nature to it at that point of time. The following year, Titash 2, as I call it, the 3 hour, 20-minute version, was shown in the Pesaro Film Festival, and I happened to be sitting in a row in which next to me was Kumar Shahani, who was seeing it for the first time. Next to him was Mani Kaul, who was seeing it also for the first time. 3 seats down was John Abraham. Another 4 seats further was Adur Gopalakrishnan. Everybody was seeing it for the very first time, and everybody came away marveling and wondering. But everybody saw it more or less as an unfinished film at that point of time. In early 90s, Titash 3 emerged. There was a third version of Titash. This was something like 40 minutes less. But more importantly, it was a tame version. It was actually a kind of a version that had made more narrative sense. You had a sense of what the Ghatak was trying to do. It had a storyline. It didn't have the kind of chaos that the earlier experiences had. It was subtitled and so on. Now, what's important is that Ritoban Ghatak, I mean, this is as far as I know, Ritoban Ghatak, who was responsible for putting this out, claimed that he had a 16 millimeter version of Titash that he said Ritik Ghatak had in fact edited and had assembled, and that this was actually, from Ghatak's point of view, the signed off version. And Ritoban had used that as the master and created a 35 millimeter version of this film. Now, since one didn't have access to the 16 mm version, one had no idea about what this was going to be. But this was Titash 3, and we had to now reconcile ourselves once again to this particular version. And then came Titash 4, as the film got gradually, if you like, kicked upstairs to becoming what Paolo Cerci Usai describes as the absolute masterpiece. These are the opening credits of Titash 4. Janus Films, it says. World Cinema Foundation. There is this whole sort of thing about the canonization of this film, about filmmakers' worldwide cooperation, identify and preserve endangered films representing diverse cultural heritage with the support of Giorgio Armani, Cartier, Qatar Airways, Qatar Museums Authority, Doha Film. And this was how the film began. This was a remastered jewel. This had the kind of glittering quality that a museum work actually has, as Patar Panchali does too. It has absolutely none of the scratches, none of the chaos of the earlier version. It is remastered. Of interest actually is that the entire film appears, the version that's been released by Criterion, the entire film does not appear to have been completely remastered. The first half has, and the second half is less so. These are films that become sort of almost trans-historical. They actually are things that they used to once upon a time be celluloid in the chaotic sense of celluloid, and have become post-celluloid. They become absolute masterpieces in Paolo Usai's sense of the term. The original Titash may well have been consigned to the same dustbin of history as Kissa Kursi Ka may have been. Because now what we have is a trans or post-historical version. Let me return to Paolo Cerci Usai here. As far as I can see, he writes, there is little justification for what we do. And I have no patience for a discipline that presumes to instruct me in what art is, or what has value as a document. Everything that isn't art, industrial, educational, scientific, promotional, amateur, propaganda, pornography, B-movies. Documents of what, he asks? Of the air, heavy with indifference, that pervades the archives where these images are kept. Of the hypocrisy of governments who tell us a film isn't worth saving unless it is a masterpiece, and then won't give us enough money to save even those. We have made a shelter for millions of reels, anything, whatever we could find, and are now forced to go the other way around and abide by the same laws which we have so proudly defied. I now give you some more sort of essays, arguments, and then I move to Indian Cine.ma. Speaking in 1984, Kumar Shahani gave what was at that time the Damodaran Memorial Lecture to historians at JNU. And the lecture was called Film as a Contemporary Art. It was published subsequently in The Social Scientist. Speaking in 1984 at JNU's celebrated Center for Historical Studies, Kumar Shahani names what he calls a Heraclitean paradox that appears to him to be intrinsic to the cinema. He describes how one day, watching Lumiere's train enter a station while sitting next to Ritwik Ghatak, the two looked on with palpitating hearts as the train chugged into the station, and then smiled, he says, as if to reaffirm our faith in the magic that could be wrought from these mute, banal, mechanically reproduced images. It occurs to Shahani that unlike the historian who apprehends the very substance, I quote him here, unlike the historian who apprehends the very substance of that flux that the word is made of, with methods like naming epochs and events to grasp what lies underneath them, the filmmaker can at best, I quote him, seize shadows and reflections in the hope of joining the historian's effort to understand and hopefully to change the world. It's of interest that as recently as 1984, Kumar Shahani was still speaking of cinema in terms of shadows and reflections and not in terms of material. He's, of course, being modest at that point. By 2000, the shadows and reflections of the cinema had become central to a major historical crossroads of both nation and indeed modernity itself. As India stood in 2000, and 2000 is when the first Information Technology Act comes in, stood at the threshold of digital technology, nothing separates the 21st century from the 20th more decisively than the sudden demise of celluloid. Privatization or the rolling back of the state as the neoconservative panacea for all of society's problems was at its height, but the 2008 financial crisis that saw the state apparatus reincarnated in a radically new neoliberal avatar, not yet a reality. The messy transition of celluloid into digital, which was a form of cleaning up the mess of celluloid, making it into this pristine, absolute masterpiece, which is what Tita Sheikh Tinodin has now become, was in some ways a kind of a technological aesthetic transition from neoconservatism to neoliberalism, and would directly directly mirror a larger transition in the very domain of the public, definition of the public domain. If celluloid had been the incarnation of Article 15, which is actually what the public domain comprises of, and if the movie theater was, along with all the other institutions of modernity, one of the things that defined the public domain of the 20th century, then digital's privatization of film viewing in the home and in the multiplex also signaled the demise of that public in all its constitutional significance. India entered an era that was not only post-cinema, but would soon also be post-television, as it sought a new utopian digital universe that would be cleaner, more neutral, freer, more autonomous, untouched, writes the IT czar Nandan Nilekani, as it were, by the legacies of the Sarkar Raj. So digitization was the clean new space of a clean new state that would put the mess of the 20th century behind it. And it was as though the mess of the 20th century was most directly reflected by the mess of celluloid. And doing away with celluloid and replacing it with the cleanliness of digital was in some ways indicative of what the new state was all about. Through much of the 20th century, it had been the unassailable conviction in the cinema's ability to capture modern history in its moving entirety that had shaped the filmmaker's destiny. Even as it shaped the great, I'm saying this also because part of this argument is actually in relation to the Film Institute, which I spoke about the last time when I was in Roper. And I'm trying to write something about the FTI strike of 2015 in relation to the cinema. And here I'm speaking about actually what I call the Great Prabhat Road institutions, which is the Prabhat Studio, replaced by the Film and Television Institute of India, which is now in its space, and across the road is the National Film Archive of India. Even as these great institutions are shaped and their endeavor to make, teach, and archive the cinema is defined. Like paper and like built form, celluloid's engagement with history was two-tiered. It was as though all of these were susceptible to the ravages of the very history they sought to capture, both materially and textually, so that even as celluloid film, paper, and built form captured history, they would also be victims of that particular history. All of them faced the existential anxiety of being inherently doomed to be consumed by their ambition. Unlike paper fragments and built form, which are, so to say, condemned to ruin, and we all know something about the fragile manuscript which you see in a museum, and you look at the kind of fragility of the manuscript, or indeed the architectural ruin. Celluloid has no available vocabulary to describe its plight as a ruin. It was committed to indestructibility. It was as though celluloid was committed to being a means, not an end. It was as though it was a medium, never material. When film, incomprehensibly threatened with extinction, found itself become a victim of the very history it was meant to record for all time to come, it was uniquely unprepared for the revelation that this was the end, and not merely an end, but the end, or to grasp why history had come to such a pass. The paradox was actually not that. The paradox was that digitization, far from killing off the ghosts of the dead past, gave the shadows and reflections of history an entirely new lease of life. Celluloid didn't die. Celluloid went, along with a huge part of the analog existence, underground. Celluloid's stubborn obduracy remained a roadblock to the dream of pristine virtualization being promised by digital restorers everywhere. This is the famous fire that takes place in the National Film Archive of India when all the nitrate stock goes, and I will say a little bit more about this. Celluloid film in this regard begins to bear resemblance to the life sciences, in which, says Carolyn Steedman, the task was also to think about the pastness, about the imperishability of matter through all the stages of growth and decay, to the point of recognition that nothing goes away. Both the suddenness of celluloid's extinction and the ferocity with which it has been sought to be stamped out in a sort of combined action of political corporate forces that I want to suggest define the neoliberal turn, it is equally inevitable that cinema has resisted, that it has survived, leaked through, producing, in Steedman's words, a double nothingness in the writing of history and in the analysis of it. It is about something that never did happen in the way it comes to be represented. The happening exists in the telling of the text, and it is made out of materials that are not there in an archive or anywhere else. There is actually nothing there, only absence of what was once dust. This is a problem that I think many people have talked about. I mean, Sudhir Mahadevan tries in his very remarkable A Very Old Machine, The Merry Origins of the Cinema in India, to separate out the archive of cinema as celluloid from the considerably wider archival possibilities of, as he says, remembering the history of cinema. So the way that when celluloid actually dies, the way it actually doesn't die or reproduces itself in ghostly remakes like Isa Kursi Ka had done, or Titash itself has done, where in a sense the form of archiving as social memory being far more complex than any archiving machine or archiving strategy could handle. I have been very interested. I mean, there have been a number of theoretical sort of works. I mean, Laura Mulvey, for example, in her very famous book, Death 24 Frames a Second, speaks of how even the banal, that is to say, the kind of banalities of the shadows and reflections that Kumar Shahani is talking about in the 20th century. I mean, a man walking down the street, a low-end comedy. I mean, those of you who've seen Jamai Babu, for example, will remember that. A low-end comedy about street scenes in Calcutta become uncanny, take on a kind of a ghostly quality when celluloid is replaced by some kind of a post-celluloid artifact that is trying to sort of reproduce or reconstruct what celluloid itself used to be and the kind of reality that celluloid had witnessed. In fact, as I said earlier, that this is actually about the Film Institute, which I had written about and spoken about. When you enter the Film Institute, you actually encounter, I don't know if all of us have been to the Film Institute in Pune or not, but when you do that, when you go past the famous gate and you enter the Film Institute, you actually encounter this split experience. I mean, what you're seeing in front of you occurred in a vault which was approximately 100 meters after you entered on the left-hand side. It is now, interestingly, a gym. When you enter the FTI, you encounter a split experience of a campus cloven into two halves with an ineffable magic on the right. That is where all the Prabhat studios are, and all the archival material was, and all the heritage buildings are. And on the left, the mundane rationalities of an emotionless, amnesiac state bureaucracy. I mean, the kind of urban brutalism of PWD architecture on the left-hand side, which bears no relationship to what you see on the right-hand side. To the right, you see a series of sheds that once provided the earliest housing of the National Film Archive of India. The existence on campus of the masterpieces of cinema would prove to be a two-edged sword, as more and more students started finding themselves having their own personal archives in hard disks that they owned. I mean, every student would own a hard disk of 1 or 2 terabytes where they would have several thousand films, far more in number than what the NFAI itself had. And more they stopped going to see screenings in the main theater. And only those students who were interested in celluloid as material were interested in going and looking at it there. It is worth mentioning in this context that The National Film Archive of India, it's of some interest. I mean, Parichay mentioned that Indian Cinema has this enormous archive. We've got something like 8,000 films here, which is already as many as, maybe even a few more than what the NFAI has of Indian cinema. But we don't, I mean, we would not claim to be what they are. The NFAI has amongst the world's smallest number of surviving films. And there would probably be good, important historical reasons for why it is so, why the NFAI never did see itself as preserving everything that was ever made. It would have to be about 10 times or more than that of the size that it is now in order to be able to have all the films that are ever made in India. But there might actually be other and more sort of uncanny reasons for why the NFAI has such few films. Some years after it was set up, the NFAI, which was actually in the sheds just outside on the right hand side as you entered, went up the road to what was a heritage bungalow that was once owned by M.R. Jaikar, the celebrated jurist and educationist and the first vice chancellor of the Pune University. It's of some interest to me that this M.R. Jaikar, whose bungalow houses the NFAI, had once written in response to a questionnaire sent to him by the Indian Cinematograph Committee in 1928 about the injurious effects of the cinema. He had said that from what little he had seen of the cinema industry, it appeared only to have taught Indians a number of vices, new forms of burglary and immorality, which the Indian mind could not have conceived without difficulty. He said, strong notions in the matter. There is, of course, some delicious irony in the fact that M.R. Jaikar, who so hated the cinema, has his bungalow becoming the National Film Archive of India. And you can actually think of some kind of a horror film of M.R. Jaikar, haunting the celluloid material of the NFAI. You go a little bit further and you find on the old CRT, the classroom theater, behind that was the only celluloid lab of any film institute in the world. This is a black and white film lab, which has come to be more or less destroyed. And what you're getting are a whole series of 35 millimeter equipment. I mean, these are Steenbecks, these are moviolas, which have been thrown out. These are Sandeep Chatterjee's photographs that he took after they chucked out their Steenbecks and moviolas just outside. It was just a few months after, in the early 2000s, when the Geeta Krishnan committee basically recommended that the Film Institute be basically disinvested and privatized, that a film student named Amit Datta stood outside the administrative offices that was in front of the main theater. The date was January 8, 2003. On that wintry morning, Amit Datta says, he saw a small wisp of smoke from the NFAI's nitrate vault opposite the wisdom tree grow steadily larger. As he looked on, an air conditioning vent dislodged itself, flying in slow motion. It seemed to be aimed directly at him. Before long, the entire campus was covered in a layer of silver. It felt, he says, like a benediction. The Havan, and he saw it as a Havan. The Havan would see a single centralized haunted house replaced by numerous decentralized ghosts, as a considerably vaster film archive would soon be reborn in the pirate bylanes of the digital highway. Coming at the fag end of a near century of negligence, the archive of evil, this is Derrida's phrase, Archive du Mal, that stands for the horrors of the past, may well possess a barely concealed intentionality. The speed of the demise of celluloid in India has been such that it often appears to have been actively pushed into ruin, even as its wealth has been plundered by the recycling agents of a new digital economy, for content by digital marketing and piracy, for material by the sheds and Dharavi, reducing celluloid to its silver and plastic components. I want to say something about being a filmmaker in this particular context. I want to suggest that in the glory days of celluloid, to be a filmmaker, you had to actually make what Paulo Usai calls the absolute masterpiece. I think that more and more, as you come into the present, you find that being a filmmaker is starting to work within what you might call a fugitive material. Like you have fugitive materials which don't last, like smoke or ash or other kinds of materials that are predetermined not to last forever. Unlike what celluloid was believed to be, more and more filmmakers are working in materials in the knowledge that this is not going to last. This was Ritvik Ghatak back in the early 70s, conducting a workshop. And, this is from Saeed Mirza's autobiography. And he says, he asked us our names, Ashok Ahuja, Kundan Shah, Vinod Chopra. Some of us replied. And he said, no, 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 Sergei Mikhailovich Eisenstein. That's the name. That's how a filmmaker sounds. Doesn't it carry weight? So Saeed Mirza, who's there, puts up his hand and he says, what if I change my name from Saeed Mirza to Saeed Akhtar Mirza? And he says, yes, Saeed Akhtar Mirza. Your name has weight now. Now you have the name of a film director. I want to suggest that by the early 2000s, to be a filmmaker in Ghatak's sense meant to be able to handle the horrors of celluloid, the ghostly presence of celluloid that was there. I want to suggest that the filmmaker becomes something else. He becomes a ghost. He becomes a hacker. And this is something that's been curiously underdeveloped in theory. In its practice, hacking comes on the heels of the collage, the ready-made, the copy and the quotation, the splicing, the sampling, and the remix. It is at best a practice that repudiates originality. It's post-originality. It's almost anti-originality, both in the maker and in the object made, working upon previously made content, whatever such content may be. Hackers who in code do not write original code, it is famously known, and filmmaker hackers do not make original films. Both enter what has existed previously. Both take over, rewrite, translate, modify. Hito Steyerl tries to describe the concept with the idea of dirty data, something gathered in the process of shooting, meaningless bits of matter that are now attributed meaning, or the capacity to extract meaning that may well both pre-exist and lie beyond the filmmaker's intervention. There are several characteristics, I think, of hacker cinema, and I will give a certain number of examples. I mean, one of them, which I was very interested in, is Kamal Swaroop's work on Phalke. Amit Datta's work on various other filmmakers, and I was very interested in R.V. Ramani's My Camera and the Tsunami, which is this film that he made about how his camera encountered the tsunami and how he encountered what Hito Steyerl might call dirty data. One factor about hacker cinema is that it does not actually have pristine content it works with. It actually works on something that has been previously worked on. It, in contrast to the high modern regisseur or the filmmaker that used to exist, who used to make the absolute masterpiece, it was assumed that filmmakers now would modify, transform matter received from multiple places, literary text, performative idioms, whatever. An early example might well be Manikol's Muktibodh essay film Satar Se Uthta Aadmi, is clearly a hack in this sense of the term, rather than something that would convert a literary work into film. The second is the repurposing of celluloid into post-celluloid. The way that people who are not working in celluloid use celluloid as a legacy, in the awareness of its essentially transient and fugitive nature. This is the end of Manikol's Siddheshwari, where those of you who've seen the film will remember that the film actually transits from a fictional work made on celluloid into a work that's actually a video. So there's only some footage of the original Siddheshwari herself, and the entire sequence has been shot inside a television studio. The repurposing of the material of cinema, celluloid, in the awareness of its transient and fugitive nature, most starkly evident in its tensions with video and digital platforms. These tensions were evident in several of the filmmakers and visual artists who came to be known in Amrit Gangar's very well-known use of the term as Prayoga practitioners. The hackers' return to cinematic materiality also appeared paradoxically to have the added benefit of producing a rough and ready archival resolution to celluloid's material transition, so that the celluloid film would not last, but the hackers' work would, because it had some other take on the transience of celluloid. For three, it led the filmmaker to be morphed from a modernist originalist, the Eisenstein of one time, into something else, into a recycler of material. A non- or post-original cinema both relied on precedent dirty data as well as created its own dirt for future hackers to work on. Cinema, especially documentary cinema in this form, but all films that worked with found materials, came to define itself within a larger production chain, taking from previous material and itself becoming available to others for future use. As filmmaking and film viewing became increasingly fused into a single entity, as viewers began watching with their hands, so to say, as we are doing more and more when we see films on YouTube, for example. What was once reception theory has now become a new generation maker culture of the meme and the gamer. Um, this actually involves a series of further developments. I mean, including, for example, how film is taught in the Film Institute and the kind of ghostly presence. Gurvinder Singh's famous film on the FTI called Untitled Zero, Untitled One, I think it is. Called has a lot of this thing about how students teach students as against teachers teaching students, how classroom pedagogy is replaced by other kinds of learnings that take place. I just wanted to show you something of my own work in this before we move to Indian Cine.ma. This is an installation that I'd been involved in which we had converted Manikol's films into a multi-channel installation where you need not anymore see it frontally, but you saw it, you walk through it, you see it from behind, and you see it in from multiple layers. Okay, I'll now move to Indian Cine.ma. I'm hoping you can see it. I'm hoping you're able to see this here. It's important for me to establish the fact that Indian Cine.ma is not a film archive. It has no intention of being a film archive. The role of being a film archive remains with the NFAI and the questions around its ability to do so. This is actually an archive about what Paulo Usai will call the supplicants, the materials that are lying, which have no use for. This is not about the absolute masterpiece. Quick little aside on statistics, what we do is that we have something like 63,011 films in India on which there is an original ID. So you can go. So this is Siddheshwari right now here in front of you. And what I have here is a version of Siddheshwari which I have talked about in other contexts, which Piyush Shah remastered, the original cinematographer, using this kind of technology. And I wanted to suggest, and I have suggested elsewhere, that what happens here is a kind of a translation of celluloid into post-celluloid as against the kind of absolute masterpiecing of it in the way that happened to Tita Shikri Nodirnam. This is a version of Siddheshwari that Piyush Shah had assembled, which is here. But to get back to Indian Cine.ma, we have 63,011 films on which there is an individual ID, of which 8,863 films were actually films that we have videos of. I want to say that when we did the Encyclopedia of Indian Cinema, one of the experiences that I think we had was that we actually grew up with this basic assumption that most of Indian cinema had been lost and that we were going to make an Encyclopedia of Indian Cinema in the firm belief, if you like, that the films themselves are never going to be available. So if India has made, by a rough argument, say 50,000 films since the coming of sound, it is probably likely that less than 4,000 to 6,000 of those films are available in the NFAI. And therefore, we assume that 40,000 of those films will simply never be available to be seen. What was really interesting was that the Encyclopedia of Indian Cinema arrived in an era which I have sometimes described as post-video and pre-internet. So it was actually something that existed in the time of video, and so you already had what I've elsewhere described as a bazaar archives, a kind of a low-end popular archives where video was replaced by 16 millimeter. 16 millimeter was replaced by video, and video would be replaced by the VCD and so on, all the way down to torrents. And you suddenly found that a lot of films that you thought were lost weren't lost. You actually found that several thousand films that the first edition of the encyclopedia annotates without having seen the films were available for viewing the second time round. when we had the second edition, and you actually were able to check with the print itself. And now I think we have a situation where the argument could be that maybe around 20, 25,000 of the 50,000 films that India has made since the coming of sound may well be discoverable if you were to find them in any version that exists. Right, so these are the true supplicants. These are the films that the NFA has not got and will never have, because first of all, because these are not absolute masterpieces, but second of all, because celluloid versions of them don't exist, and they don't know how to deal with something that's not celluloid. So these films, these, if you like, digital artifacts exist of something that once upon a time was cinema, which is something that's gone into this new space, and we are treating it as such. So when you're looking, for example, at Siddheshwari, you're seeing what in front of you. You're seeing a timeline version of it. You can see the film itself here. But what you can do is all kinds of things, such as, for example, you can mark an beginning and an end, and you can annotate, on one side, you can put keywords, you can annotate, you can search, you can kind of assemble all the clips that you have together. So, for example, I may have Anarkali in Indian cinema here, or you may have, I think there's one version which I had got all the versions of Devdas, the final return of Devdas, attached to each other, and they can actually be reproduced without necessarily existing in themselves, simply by a search query kind of assembling them in the order that you want to make them. What you can get is, in fact, other ways in which films can be looked at in their entirety. So this is the timeline view of Siddheshwari, and I'll show you, if I can, the sequence, the final sequence of the video. Here we are. Okay. I don't know if you can see the moving image, but it's actually moving almost like as though in a sentence or something. It's got a. So yeah, there are all kinds of other features here which I can talk about if you have any questions. But I'm kind of done with this right now. I'll just end with a very last example, which I really love. This is K. Abbas's Dharti Ke Lal, and here is a sequence in the film. What happened was this with Dharti Ke Lal. After we found Dharti Ke Lal, we found that in his autobiography, in I Am Not an Island, K. Abbas writes, and if you see the blue, you'll get it here. He writes this. Originally, we planned to do the entire outdoor shooting on Calcutta's pavements and to stage the massive hunger march with the help of the Kisan Sabhas of the province. We even went to Calcutta with our camera equipment and some of our artists, hoping to call the others when necessary. The city, however, was still under military occupation and we had to retreat. We could, he writes, only surreptitiously take 2 shots, one showing the hero, the younger son played by Anwar Mirza, plying a rickshaw, and a shot of one of Chaurangi's palatial hotels of the dustbins in front of it, with some scrounging urchins around it, and some American GIs and British Tommies strolling by. So they were only able to take 2 documentary shots in Calcutta, 3, I think. A few minutes later, we were hauled up by the military police, and pretending not to have taken any shot, yet we escaped with a warning that no shooting would be permitted anywhere in the city or the province without prior submitting of the script and the plan to the shooting, the civil, etc., etc. Now, we got very interested in where were these 3 shots? I mean, where were these particular shots of the actual documentary footage in Calcutta? And here they are now. So actually tagged this particular line, this small paragraph from I Am Not an Island to the sequence itself. This is the camera panning down, panning right. And I'm pausing here. I don't know if you can see the two GIs and Tommies or whatever that he talks about at the back there. I'm showing it with the screen. I don't know if you're able to see it. Um, but this is the only documentary shot that was clandestinely taken of Dharti Ke Lal. Okay, I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ashish, for the sheer range of this. I'm still, kind of recovering from it. I was expecting something on the film archive and its ephemerality and materiality, of course, and your observations on Parichay and, of course, your work in this field in the context of Indian cinema. But the presentation touches so many other points, and I think our audience must have a lot of questions. So if you not only questions, but if you want to raise your concerns, issues, if you have observations, please type them in the YouTube chat box, and I'll let that in.
Sure. I mean, it doesn't. I mean, I realize that people aren't that comfortable with typing in questions, so they may not. But if you have any even practical questions or otherwise, http://indiancine.ma. All the films that are 50 years and more recent are, so to say, under the copyright C/ thing, which means that you can't see them unless you are logged in. But we don't charge anything, and all bona fide researchers and students may please approach us for usernames and passwords, and we will give them quite fairly freely. And after that, you'll be able to access everything that's on there. It's a totally free site. But no, but Divya and Parichay, if you have any questions or comments or responses, we can at least have conversation started while we wait for the other questions.
But Parichay, I'll ask. I actually have a question of my own, but I'll come to that.
No, I don't have a question perhaps, but observations. Since you mentioned Amrit, and Amrit will be speaking tomorrow.
Yeah.
He sent his PowerPoint and some of the clips. So
Yeah.
Amrit will. We have got the first question. I will come to that later. So Amrit will be screening excerpts from Anand Patwardhan's documentaries, but more importantly for me, he will be showing parts of Kavani Nadi Chivannapur, P.A. Baker's film.
Yeah.
So Amrit's narrative, the narrative that he is trying to share with us, it's about a film society activist who was involved during in film society movement during the emergency, which Bombay Screen Unit and other outfits in the city. At the same time, he's looking at the films and the process of making. As P.A. Baker, on the very day the shooting was done for Kavani Nadi, as far as I can recall, P.A. Baker and his cinematographer, they were arrested, right? And police stormed into the theatre in Trivandrum when the film was being shown. They objected to that masked dance sequence in the film, which Amrit will be showing tomorrow. So I was just wondering whether Indian cinema, apart from this excellent collection and this options of annotating the films, making your spectator, part of your spectators actively become part of the archive making process. So, are you also interested in kind of making some oral history archive with film society members and activists?
Yeah. No, it's something I've been involved in. But which is actually where Indian Cinema.ma's house has been actually doing this, and I mean, they did one very interesting one with Saeed Mirza and Salim Langde Pe Matro, where he actually sort of speaks over the film. So there is some of that as well, and they've actually more recently done something in relation to urban housing and film material. So there's a whole sort of body of work that so it is possible to actually as used to happen in DVDs, or in fact sometimes even happens, I think, in Amazon.com, Amazon Prime, that you can actually stop a sequence and you can get an annotated sort of underpinning of it, so you know who you're looking at or what this is about or what filmmakers may have to say about it and so on. Yes. film society organizers, we have not really gone. I mean, but Dharamsi Bhai has been a key figure, and there was a set of conversations involving him and silent cinema, which in fact Kaushik Bhaumik, I don't know if he's here, had he'd been in
Yeah.
conversation with Dharamsi Bhai on in one of the events that we had organized. Um, there have been others, but I think a lot of people from different backgrounds have actually annotated films with very different interests and very different things that they have read into the what they've seen.
Dibbo, you wanted to ask something?
No, I would be holding it because I think there are already two questions waiting, and
Yes.
since we are on a calendar and a schedule, I
Yeah.
think it's better to go towards them.
So this is the first
I would-
question. Ashish, can you see it?
When film becomes old, it becomes richer. Passage of text goes transformation. I think that the passage of text goes transformation. What does that mean? Well, there's a problem with that, right? I mean, the thing is that, in a curious way, I mean, when I was growing up, there was an entire like nostalgia economy. I mean, the old is gold kind of thing. That the true masterpieces were the silent films or the films made in the 30s, 40s, and so on. And there was, I think, a curious kind of a tension on the one hand between the aura that they had on the one side with their own sort of vulnerability or destructibility on the other. But at that point of time, I think the richness of the films wasn't necessarily connected to their physical destruction. But the richness now, there's been a whole richness economy attached to it, and Criterion and other such sources, I mean, and festivals will constantly come up with newer and newer sort of remastered versions, which is what Paolo Cerci-Usa is getting so anxious about, because these are just masterpieces being shown again and again and again, and the canonization of the fairly conventional authorial canons of the 20th century being the Bergmans and the Kurosawas and the Antonionis and so on. You just keep on getting more and more newer and newer versions of those. So the idea of returning what you might call the aura or the auratic to films that otherwise are unshowable, and not only unshowable for technical reasons, but literally unshowable. I mean, when you look at a lot of the films made in the 40s and 50s, it's extremely hard to sit through them, to have the patience to actually sort of watch films of that time, to actually convert them into something that makes them once again viewable, is a whole new challenge. So yes, they can get richer, but I think the challenge of enriching them is really part of the problem. When you see them in this new informational kind of space. I mean, obviously Netflix is doing it, and all the other kind of platforms are doing it. But again, I think this is a Paulo Usai's critique. There's a fairly limited, range of materials that they make available, which are then the ones that are being enriched. And it's the enriching of the supplicants, in his terminology, that's really the challenge before us.
So we have one more question. So this one.
The Titash opening sequence. Well, it was I didn't know the Titash is a film that has been barely, I think, barely scratched the surface of Titash. Um, as we've looked at it does have. I mean, it's an extreme wide angle shot that was taken, so that that curved horseshoe like effect that you have in the beginning is very, very remarkable. But I have not done any work that attaches it either to Jean Renoir's film, or I don't even know, and I wouldn't consider myself qualified to talk about that.
Can I intervene? So I think Priya Jayakumar's recently published work, Her Histories Reside, India as Film Space. There's a massive chapter on Renoir's use of space and location shooting and its abstraction and Orientalism in the river. And in that context, Jayakumar evokes Pita Setti Nodima. So, Bhairav, as you have asked this question, you may go through that particular section in Jayakumar's book. That's a way of looking at the idea of cinematic space and abstraction
Right.
and pro-filmic space.
Right.
Uh, thanks. So, thanks, Ashish. Thanks, Dibbo, and our audience for being there. Um, so I think we're running late.
Okay.
Yeah.
So thanks very much, Ashish, for the very engaging presentation.
Thank you.
And so
Thank you.
hopefully we'll be able to come up with an edited book with all the papers in the two different events
Yeah.
in this
Okay.
project. So that way we'll be able to document and archive all the thoughts that are free flowing at the moment. So all of you, please come back at 5 p.m. For the session with Kaushik Bhowik.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.